Welcome to Socializing Security, where every week we have a discussion about security, compliance, and beyond.
Our goal is to learn and grow by socializing each week's topic with each other, our guests, and with you.
A quick compliance note, this podcast is meant for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal or regulatory advice.
We're glad you've joined us, and we hope you'll learn along with us. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Socializing Security. We're back with you for another week. Milou, how you doing?
Pretty good. What about you?
Pretty good. Post sickness recovery and just a busy life. Yeah, it just always seems to take a long time to get the energy levels back up. So trying to keep them up for all of you. And we have the most exciting topic to discuss, so it's going to be super easy. Today we're going to talk about third-party vendor management.
There was sarcasm in there if you couldn't.
No, it's super exciting for some people, but it's a super important topic. It's one that we've kind of touched on at different times, so I'm figured we'd touch on this one specifically. I think we'll probably focus more on the kind of the onboarding assessment side of things, and then we might be able to follow up with more of the ongoing management side of things, because obviously that's a very different topic once you've got them onboarded. You don't want to just forget they're there and just let everything just kind of slide. So let's kind of start, Milou. If you want to talk about kind of what a third-party vendor review is and kind of why it's so important.
Yeah. So when we're thinking about it, for the most part, we're talking about tech companies that you're potentially bringing into your system, or you're sharing confidential information with a different vendor to deliver a service, right? So a third-party vendor review is really the assessment that you're doing to verify that they are doing what they're saying they're supposed to be doing, as well as if they're meeting your information security privacy requirements and their legal requirements. So it's usually a combined effort between compliance, legal, IT, security, and then the actual team that's procuring the particular service that they're looking to acquire. So it is a multi-departmental process, I would say. Generally, it should be. And so it's one where ideally the team is working together to vet a vendor to make sure that, they hit all the requirements and can easily blend into the system. And generally, they're done kind of based off of risk. So, if it's a high risk vendor, the review should have more scrutiny than maybe like a lower risk vendor, just kind of depending on what data they're accessing, what systems they're touching, is it a production system vendor versus like marketing, like events manager or something? Those reviews can be very different depending on the sensitivity of the information that's being shared with the different parties.
So on that front, as you mentioned, it's multidisciplinary, it's multi-teams generally being involved. What's the level of importance for them to, I guess I'll go into it with an agreement as to what's most important to have? Do you generally see, hey, one team says, hey, we need to make an evaluation. We want to buy the software. So when you look at the different teams that get brought in to do that evaluation, teams like, compliance, security, the business team that's asking for the software or that vendor to be onboarded, they all have different needs and requirements. The question really becomes to me is, do those teams all need to sit down together and agree upon, hey, here's the collective set of requirements that we need to abide by? Or is it more of a, hey, let's all just start attacking this vendor with our questions and, not really coordinating together? Like, I guess I'm trying to get an understanding of how important it is for the team to go in united beforehand versus figuring that out as you go along.
I would say it's probably a lot smoother if it's like a coordinated approach. And ideally they're following like a standardized process, because it would be strange if like one vendor is required to jump through certain hoops and the other one isn't. Again, some of that could very much be about the different sensitivity or like risk of the vendor's access and the categorization of what the vendor is actually processing. So ideally, I would advocate for a coordinated approach, especially because I think that can reduce the back and forth with the actual vendor, because otherwise, they might be asking for the business requirements and then compliance comes in and then security comes in. And so I would say ideally they're following like a standardized process that's coordinated with the team. They know exactly what they're asking for. They understand the requirements. They understand the risk of the vendor. I think it's pretty important for the team to decide relatively early on what the vendor risk is, because I think, again, that can help speed up the process a little bit. If they know if it's a lower risk vendor, again, the level of scrutiny should be lower. So the review should be a little bit quicker. So I would say I would definitely advocate for a coordinated approach where possible.
That And that makes perfect sense. You did talk about risk a couple times, and that being kind of the main way collectively it should be evaluated. I mean, obviously there's functional requirements that need to be discussed and figured out. I see this as more of what we're talking about in this context is more of the, okay, we think this vendor is going to functionally meet us, or there's going to be a couple companies that'll functionally meet our needs. Let's figure out which one's the least risky, or make sure it fits within the risk tolerance. How much of that risk tolerance do you usually see worked out ahead of time again? Or is this something that as you talk to them, you're like, okay, that's risky, that's not risky? Or is it hey, they need to be, hard and fast, these things need to be identified?
I think it's kind of as you are vetting the vendor and you're starting to understand what systems are going to be accessing, what level of confidential information they're going to be processing on behalf of the company. Is it customer data? Is it internal company data? I think that should come up as the team is really starting to explain what's the business case for bringing on this vendor for XYZ reason. I think from there, as the review continues, again, maybe the risk changes, maybe they identify it as a high risk. And then as they kind of get in and are like, actually, we're not going to give it access to these, to production. Maybe it's only internal stuff. Then maybe that drops down to a medium, for example. So I think a risk conversation should start early. It's definitely up to renegotiate throughout the process, I think. But for the most part, it's usually pretty clear, like, this is going to be a high risk vendor. We're going to treat it like that for the whole process. I think it's less I think it happens less often that they really change that. But I think that should be one of the first conversations that the team has.
Yeah, to really understand, what level of risk this might incur. Like, you're going to know going into it, hey, this thing's we want it to process our HIPAA data. So it's going to be a high risk situation. We need to make sure they dot every I and cross every T, versus, hey, this is going to be something from our marketing platform that has no reason to have access to any of our email lists or anything like that. It's just going to be helping us serve up web pages in some dynamic fashion. It's probably going to be low risk. And unless the conversation triggers something else, you kind of keep it in that kind of tier and give it that level of scrutiny based on that, right? Are there any standardized things? Like we've talked a lot about different compliances, SOC 2 being a big one, I assume is going to play into this. I mean, is any of the stuff that, as we do this evaluation, is standardized, that they would be expecting us to ask them, or that is going to contain most of the information that we want to know?
Depends on the vendor. You used to see a lot of requests for SIG and SIG Lite and SIG Core. I feel like that was a really large one. That was it's a vendor assessment that you can do. I think SIG Lite is free and SIG Core you pay for. Again, I think it's pretty common that people are going to require a SOC 2 or an ISO 27001. In general, I think for US companies, those are kind of seen as interchangeable. I personally would probably put more weight on an ISO 27001 than I would a SOC 2 these days, just because the standard has just changed pretty dramatically.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot harder to maintain an ISO 27001 program than it is a SOC 2 these days. So, and again, you can also ask for a CSA star. That's usually a pretty great questionnaire that has a good amount of baseline information from a security standpoint for the vendor. It also covers privacy as well. So again, it's also pretty nice to ask the vendor for their standard package of hey, what do you normally provide, as opposed to being oh, we have this one-off questionnaire, could you do this? I would always kind of be in the camp of ask them what they have, see it, and then again, if it doesn't hit the requirements, then absolutely share your own questionnaire that they need to fill in. But I would assume most of them probably already have a good amount of information already documented in some standardized fashion, whether that's a SIG or, their own internal questionnaire. That's fine, as long as your team can kind of process it and interpret the information and see that it hits the requirements. I think that's kind of really what is needed. So yeah, I would ask them what they have first,
Mm-hmm.
ask them for their standard package, and then go from there.
Okay. And commonly, does that standard package include things like privacy notices and terms of use, cyber insurance, their own BCDR plans, their own cyber incident response plans? Are those generally included in those things, or those things that you've had to ask for specifically?
I think the specific policies you usually have to ask for, as well as cyber insurance. It's less common that they provide that right away. And then also penetration testing results and stuff like that. Usually that's not, again, very often it's covered within the SOC 2 in the sense that they've done it and they the auditors tested that they did a pen test. But if you actually want to see the results, you usually have to ask for that. So again, those might be again, part of your standardized list of being hey, these are the things we always want to ask for. Whether or not they have them, that might be a conversation to decide oh, we absolutely have to have this versus not. That's kind of up to the team, I think, as they're going. But again, I think when you're coming to specific policies, I think it kind of depends on the vendor. Like I'm usually in the wheelhouse of like put that stuff on a trust portal behind an NDA and like give them
Mhm.
as much as they want just to, again, facilitate a quicker review. But I think it kind of depends. But I would say generally, if you're going to want more sensitive information, like the insurance policy, as well as maybe pen test results and stuff like that, those are probably going to be like additional requests you're going to ask after they send the first package.
Yeah, I mean, having been on the other side of the sales side of this, the vendor portal aspect of it can be huge because us trying to sell stuff to a customer, we want that to go as quick and fast and as painless as possible, and providing all of this information sucks as part of that, as part
Yeah.
of the deal. And so ideally, like in in a larger organization, larger vendor, they'll probably have that. They'll probably have access. And to your point with the standard package, that's all going to be up on that site. They'll be like, yeah, sign this NDA and we'll give you access to this portal where all that information is. Smaller vendor may not, because they're still kind of learning the ropes. It's not a high priority at that point. Everything's a little bit bespoke in that perspective. So maybe talk a little bit about, we've both done a lot of startups, so we've seen both sides of this. But there's oftentimes the business says we need this one specific tool. There's only one company that sells this one specific thing. They're going to be small. They may not be the easiest to deal with. What caveats, what special scenarios do we tend to run into when dealing with a vendor like that?
I think when you're dealing with a smaller vendor, like a startup that has a specific niche that your team is really looking for, and maybe their program is just less mature because they're a younger organization, I think at that point I would very much like work with them to see like what do they have already in place and see if they also have a roadmap for some of the gaps. Say, they're working on their SOC 2, for example, and it's like, okay, like we can tolerate that for 6 months or something like that, coming up with kind of a plan of what makes sense to kind of like check the box for now, and working with them as somebody who's been on the other side of that, where, we had to have high trust, for example, or, a specific ISO standard and we didn't have it. Generally, if it was the right deal, we were able to like kind of negotiate and come up with milestones and just like continue to report with that particular customer being like, hey, we just did this. And like, this is the next step of the process. And we were able to show that roadmap and that actually worked. And we were able to secure those deals. So I think if it's a smaller company, I would just ask like what their plan is to remediate their gaps, what they're currently doing, see how transparent they can be about like kind of their shortcomings, and then see if you can tolerate coming up with a plan. Maybe that means reducing the information you're sharing with them until they hit that check mark, or coming up with a plan to that effect to just minimize potentially like data access or, what you're sharing with them until they have the specific requirement you're looking for. But I would definitely just try to be like open with them. Again, sometimes it very much might just be like, no, this is too immature of a company. This isn't the right fit. Let's go find somebody else who's like more mature, who we feel more confident in. But again, I've seen it both ways. I have had special circumstances where we've had large, like, even the government or large customers like approve working with a tool that didn't maybe hit all of their requirements, as long as we continue to show like good faith efforts that we were making progress to the requirements they were looking for.
Yeah, I mean, in my experience, everything's negotiable, especially when you're talking about a smaller vendor, especially if it's a startup. There are risks working with the startup, but there are a lot of advantages. One of those is the fact that they have more flexibility than a large vendor would. They're more responsive to customer needs. So, hey, we really need you to have that high trust. I know it's not super easy. You don't have it today. Have you started on it? Maybe give me a little bit of information about how close you think you would be. What timelines you're thinking about doing it. If we were to sign up, could you accelerate that, get that in writing, get some, you might be able to get discounts early on to account for that. Those types of things are always negotiable, more so with smaller vendors than they are with the larger vendors. So yeah, definitely resonates with me there. You talked about, you may, as the company buying into that vendor, there's always a level of this vendor isn't perfect. I don't have everything that I need. Functionally, a lot of us have had to deal with that. I've definitely dealt with that. It's like, okay, here's 3 vendors. Each one of them has 80% of what I need, but they all cover different 80%. That gap of 20% is different for each one. Then you've got to kind of decide, like, of that 20%, which of those 20% are the most important. If not one is more important, then non-functional requirements come into play. And I've seen it where there are hard and fast. Security says, no, we cannot bring this vendor in. Sorry, move on to the next one. I guess, what's the flexibility you've seen in there as to not only, I mean, every team's got their non-negotiables, and every team's got their negotiables. But what's the best way to kind of navigate that internally within the organization when the vendor can't necessarily meet all the requirements?
I hate to say it, I think it really depends on the vendor and exactly like the system access, right? Because again, like if we're talking about a lower risk vendor, the hoops should be small. Like they should have fewer hoops to jump through to get the contract signed. I would say in an instance where, the security team comes in and says absolutely not, or no, this just really isn't going to work. My guess is it's probably a production level, like, app level vendor that's really going to have access to the keys to the kingdom. And they really want to then make sure that they're secure enough to actually be able to support the data. So I hate to say that it depends, but I really think it does. Ideally, though, you would document the no's to make sure that it's pretty clear for the team so that, again, you kind of have like a repeatable process so that it's not just kind of like random why one vendor didn't hit it versus the other. I would definitely make sure you're documenting the rejections too to make sure that it's pretty clear for the team so that it is like repeatable and that one vendor doesn't sneak in through the process versus another. I would repeat it and just document the no's so that you have a pretty clear understanding as to why and like a justification as to why it was denied.
Yeah. And I mean, from my perspective, if I'm evaluating vendors and I know the security team said no for this other vendor for this other reason, I know to look for that before I even send it to them. So now I've made my process quicker, my process more efficient, as well as the overall process more efficient as well. So we get a lot of information. We've got tons of information. We've got several different departments. Sorry, you've got a bunch of different departments within the organization, all looking for their things and trying to evaluate that. I guess what's a good process that you've seen for bringing this all together? We've got a SOC 2 report, and we've got this privacy policy and their incident response plans, and they're all laid out on the table. And IT's been looking at their pieces, and security's been looking for their pieces. How do we bring that together? Is it just everybody sits in a room and says, "Here are my concerns"? Is it some sort of spreadsheet people should fill out in order to document all these things? Like, what have you seen work real well in that side of things?
I think the best thing I've seen work is like a ticket flow that really assigns it to individual teams for their particular portion so that it goes through like IT compliance, legal reviews and stuff, that it's like pretty well documented of like what the teams needed. I'd say that's probably the thing I've seen work the cleanest, as well as probably be the most successful in audit, where it's super clear of like which team was responsible for which decision, and that decision tree is pretty well documented. Honestly, though, as long as it's written down somewhere, I think that's probably like the biggest win, because that's a pretty big gotcha for audits where, something happened in a meeting and it's not documented well, and then it's really hard to retrace to being like, oh, this is why we justified that this vendor was medium risk and we looked at these things. I would say I would hope that it's documented somewhere, whether that's in a spreadsheet or a ticket or even via email. I don't really think it matters that much, as long as it's documented somewhere that you guys can trace it back when it comes up inevitably during the audit, so that it's pretty clear, like, oh, this is why we made that decision, and we can repeat that decision. I think is probably the most important thing. Again, I've seen it work really well where it's a ticket that like has individual workflows that tags different team members for their particular role. I think that works pretty well, but as long as it's documented somewhere, I think that's probably the biggest requirement.
Yeah, I mean, through the last couple things we've talked about, it's running through my head is the typical how do you deal with risk. I mean, you can ignore it and pretend it doesn't exist. You can document it and say we accept this risk and we're just going to deal with it, or you can remediate it. You can try to eliminate the risk. And so that documentation piece is super important throughout the process, so that those risks that you do accept and say, we understand there's a risk, it's documented, there's a reason why, there's potentially a fallout plan for that should something go awry in that space. And yeah, we accepted this risk and it happened. Here's how we're going to deal with it. Our common things we've talked about multiple times that apply very heavily there. At that point, then we've talked to the vendor, we've answered all of our questions. They've either given us answers that we can fully accept. They've given us answers that are like, well, we could do this middle ground. We've negotiated something in that front. We kind of get to that point of the contract. And this is where everything really kind of comes together. We've agreed as a team that we're going to move forward with this vendor, and therefore we need to put together this contract, which is the place, if I understand it right, where all of the risk acceptance that we do, all of the risk mitigations that we put together, all essentially have to end up in black and white, right?
Yeah, ideally.
So is there anything special with that process itself beyond what we've already talked about? We've documented it. So now we can, here's the risk register that we need you to deal with. This all has to be in the contract. It goes into lawyer land, which is a place I'm not comfortable with. Is there anything special in there that could pop up or that is new that hopefully the team's already discussed all of this, but are there any unknowns that go into it at that point?
Ideally, there shouldn't really be unknowns at that part. Like at that point of the process, it should be pretty clear that the legal team's probably already reviewed the terms and has at least flagged like, hey, these are the ones that, we have issue with, or these are the ones we need to negotiate on. Ideally, though, the security requirements, the data breach requirements, those are actually set in stone and actually documented. Say, for example, if they do require a SOC 2, that you're actually saying that they required to do the SOC 2 and that's in contract, so that you have the ability to fall back on that for whatever reason, should they not have the report available or something like that. I would say that's pretty important to make sure it's well documented in there. I think that's something that I think in standard terms, especially when they're like online, a lot of service providers, I think, are moving away from that. So I think those are kind of the gotchas to make sure that the legal team are looking for those, to making sure like, hey, the data breach response is actually codified, whether that's actually in the terms of service or say in like a BAA later, like that's fine. It's just making sure that it's documented somewhere that, again, there is something for the legal team to fall back on should there be an incident, that, it was actually set in stone that they were required to do those things.
Cool. So then we're done, right? We don't need to review that vendor any further. There's no follow-ups. We just go buy and install and maintain the software at that point, right?
Ideally for the first maybe 6 months. It kind of depends on how often you're reviewing the vendor to see, if they're actually following their commitments. I'd say generally companies are doing annual reviews for their vendors these days. Again, maybe it's more frequent if it's, a more critical provider. I'd say generally, though, most companies are doing annual reviews for their vendors. They're doing more frequent access reviews, probably quarterly for like their high risk vendors, but they're not necessarily looking for a SOC 2 report more than once a year. So I think then it kind of falls into this like annual review, which ideally I would also loop in like the finance team to make sure that like everything makes sense in terms of like how the contract is being billed, as well as then, compliance is making sure that they have all the requirements they need, and just doing that review on a regular basis. Again, I think most common is every like once a year.
Yeah. And there's probably ongoing things too that, like I said, maybe we do a second episode where we talk about managing these vendors at this point, because some of the same stuff is going to apply, but other things are going to be, as the product changes, new things are going to happen. They're going to introduce AI. They're going to introduce new cloud functionality. They may introduce new sub-processors of their own. Those types of things are all going to change the nature of that relationship and change the nature of the risk that particular vendor provides. I think the last thing I want to end on, because we have to, and I said the words and I got to ask the question, is AI. Is there anything special that you've seen when it comes to onboarding an AI vendor? So, hey, we want our team to have access to Claude or ChatGPT or whatever that might be. Is there anything special in that regard, or should we look at them as just another vendor with another piece of software that is going to hoover up our data and do stuff with it?
In general, I would say the review looks similar. I would say the thing where it varies is really to see, is the model actually being trained on your data, or is that separate? I think I would very much ask a vendor these days, what is their stance on AI? I think most vendors these days probably have like this is what we're doing in AI, probably like an AI like overview statement of like how they're using it. Are they training the models with customer data or not? I would very much, if it's an AI specific vendor, I would look at what they're using to train their model. Is your data going to be used to train the model, or is it separate? And then again, I would also just ask your existing tech vendors, like, what is their stance on AI? What tools are they using? Again, is customer data being used to train their models? Are they internal models versus external ones? So I would definitely probably add to your current vendor reviews of like asking for their AI usage statement. Again, I think that's pretty common these days for vendors to have one. They really should at this point, like have a stance on their AI usage.
Yeah. I mean, everybody's asking about that at this point and worried about who's using, how many levels down before we get to an AI engine, because it's in there somewhere.
Yeah.
Cool. Anything else to call out that we didn't touch on? Any particular things that people should put more focus on or less focus on as they go through the process?
No, I would say don't dread it too much. Vendor reviews aren't the like most glamorous part of a compliance function or role. I would say try to lean pretty heavily on the actual like tool managers to actually collect information and stuff, to get them more involved in the process, to make sure everybody's on the same page. They know what they're expected to pull every year. They know what the review is going to look like. I think, again, standardization is key here to just make it a little bit more seamless. It's easier if it's done by risk criticality is great. And then from there, you can kind of change what is required for each vendor, I would say create regular cadences with your managers to make sure they're super clear on what the requirements are and that those reviews don't feel like super burdensome.
Yeah. Make sure it's the easy way is the right way. Cool. Well, Milou, thank you for running the gauntlet on those questions. Definitely more your area of expertise, but I definitely learned, and I hope the audience learned along with me. Not the most glamorous topic, like you said, but definitely an important one. So it's one that, we should all be thinking about. But with that, we'll let you all go. We really appreciate you joining us, and any feedback, if you want to go deeper in any of these areas, let us know, info@socializingsecurity.com, or hit us up on LinkedIn, where we mostly exist from a social media perspective. So appreciate you all, and we'll talk to you again next time.
Bye, y'all.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Socializing Security. We hope you learned a thing or two with us.
If you'd like to continue socializing with us on this topic or have feedback, we'd love to hear from you on LinkedIn or social media. Just search for Socializing Security. Or you can email us at info@socializingsecurity.com.
Until next time, stay social and stay secure.